So this evening, as I said, you have tuned into everything you need to know about special needs trusts. It is a Connections California event. Connections California is PHP's newest program, an online resource and information hub for transition to adulthood and adulthood services for pretty much people with any kind of disability. And this evening's presenter is Stephen Dale. Stephen is an attorney and disability rights advocate, serves on several boards and committees of disability rights organizations. He spends much of his time attending disability rights activities, including legislative hearings and serving on boards and committees of disability rights organizations. He teaches courses to the public, financial professionals, and other attorneys on special needs trusts and trust administration. And he's a frequent speaker on a variety of disability-related topics across the country, a longstanding member of the Special Needs Alliance and trustee of the Golden State Pooled Trust. This evening, also joining us will be Amy Tesler, helping with the Q&A part, and she is also with the Golden State Pooled Trust. So we thank you for coming. Please remember that no donation is too small. We appreciate everything, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me again. Okay, let's go to the hardest part of the program. Let's see if I can get the right screen up. I have the wrong slide up, but we'll get to that. Okay, we got the right slide up?
No.
No.
We have Professional Fiduciary Association of California.
Which is a very fine group, but that is the wrong slide. Okay, so while I told you this is the hardest part of this here.
And everybody, it worked in rehearsal.
Yeah, I know. There we go. Well, let's try that. Is that better?
There we go.
Okay.
We are good to go. Thank you, Steve.
Once again, want to thank you for coming. I think we keep having this discussion. I think I've been doing this for 3 decades. I have no idea at this point as part of doing this for so long here. But been doing programs for PHP for a long time for just a number of reasons here. One is just there's so much information and education and that sort of thing, and that's going to have a lot to do with what we're going to talk about tonight, because part of community living and all of that is really not just putting trust together or dealing with conservatorships or whatever. It's really understanding, the complexity of community living. As I like to say, people are always trying to find simple solutions for complex problems, but I think disability and simple are 2 words that don't go together. Part of what I really want to bring tonight is I want to go through everything you need to know about special needs trust, although we're going to cover just the highlights and the important part. But I also want to share with you, 3 decades of work I've done in the special needs world. And I have to tell you, when I first got involved in this, I really didn't appreciate the complexity of the actual administration of the trust. As an attorney, once again, I have to learn that as time goes on, because the document itself isn't really all that complicated, but it's the application that matters. So what I really want to share with you, both in the presentation, but hopefully in some of the questions, are what does it actually take to make this work? One thing as we get started, and I usually have a slide on this, and this isn't just because of the Barbie movie, which I will be seeing very soon, but, I want to introduce Kathy here. And just imagine this: if you're doing your planning, you come into the office of some attorney, or if you go to a pooled trust here, and to protect, let's say, your 17-year-old with a significant disability, and let's say your child is likely to have a normal lifespan, and let's say he or she is 17 years old, and some tragic accident happens and you pass away, and the trust actually goes into administration. Kathy, if she's 17 years old, is supposed to live until she's 87, and this trust could go under administration for 70 years. So part of what you have to look at is, when you're doing these trusts, is really kind of think forward, no matter how old your loved one or child is that these things last for a very long time. And the other part of this is I've been doing disability related work arguably my entire lifetime because we don't have time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on my background, but definitely over the last 60 years. And I have to tell you, the changes I have seen over the last 70 years have brought us to a place where I could never have imagined, both good and bad. What's going to happen over the next 60 or 70 years, I have no idea. Here, somebody will have to tell me when we get there. So as we go into this, what we're going to talk about is the differences about trust, some of the lingo, how the trust works, how to set it up. And one thing that I'm hoping to spend some time on is really the most important part of this is who's going to administer this silly thing to try to achieve the objectives of the trust here, which should be more than just preserving public benefits. It really should be focused on quality of life and also some of the essential characteristics of special needs trusts that oftentimes kind of get overlooked. Now, as I like to call this here, oftentimes when both professionals and families approach this, all too often they approach this as, as I need to get a trust done, like this is some sort of a commodity. Okay. It's what I call the magic document syndrome. Now I'm not here to hawk trust. And quite frankly, we have a backlog in our office. There's a lot of really fine practitioners out there, but we believe we write a really fine trust. But the fact of the matter is that having a piece of paper is going to help in putting together how you're going to provide for your disabled loved one for the rest of their life. And really, what we should be looking at doing is creating a systems of checks and balances here about how distribution should be made. And also make sure that document has the flexibility to change as rules and laws change in ways that we probably couldn't even imagine. So when we go to special needs trust basics, here's where these things come from. And sometimes if you understand why they're the way they are, the rest of this makes sense. Okay. Most or many of the essential public benefits, not all, but many. And we're talking SSI, Medi-Cal, in-home support services, and certain long-term care services are based on SSI and or Medi-Cal eligibility. We call it Medicaid in other states here. And so with those programs, for years and years and years, there's been a limit on the amount of resources the beneficiary can have. And it's been at 2,000 since, I believe, 1989. Medi-Cal's changed, but we're not going to get into that today. But it's been that way for years. The other part of qualifying for these benefits is any income, any cash you receive is going to reduce your benefits dollar for dollar. So where special needs trust came from is they're a form of what's called a spendthrift trust. Okay, it's a trust or a contract to meet the objective, and the objective is to be able to set aside the funds without interfering with public benefits. So if the trust is drafted specifically so the assets are not considered available, then you can put any amount of assets into a special needs trust and not interfere with SSI, Medi-Cal, IHSS, and those programs. Now, here's where the problem comes in with this, which is that many of you, and we have to keep in mind that persons with disabilities, they're not objects, they're people here. And what we're trying to do often is trying to work with our beneficiaries, our disabled loved ones, about um, having more control over their lives, about you know, being involved in all of that. And with the big move of supported decision making and all that, really empowering persons with disabilities when it makes sense to do that. Well, we turn around and create these trusts, which are spendthrift trusts, where the trustee has sole and absolute discretion and the beneficiary has none, which is required in order to qualify for these programs. Can you see the tension between those two things, which is trying to enable your disabled loved one to have as much independence as possible, and yet setting up a trust where the trustee has sole and absolute discretion? Now, if you understand that, then no matter what you're trying to do, you can draft a trust that's going to meet your objectives. Once you do that, once you set up a trust where the trustee has absolute discretion and the beneficiary cannot demand any of the resources, otherwise they would be considered available, and you'd lose your qualifications for benefits. Here, the trust can be used to meet the needs of the beneficiaries, and I'm going to make a correction here. Any needs of the beneficiary, whether they're covered by public benefits or not. Let me give you an example. Denti-Cal, it's getting a lot better. I think it's gone from horrible to problematic in many cases, and it really depends on the region you're in. So part of this, even if Denti-Cal covers certain expenses or whatever, I, as the trustee, can actually say, no, I'm going to go ahead and pay for a specialist, even though I could have this covered here by Medi-Cal, because I think that's in the best interest of my beneficiary. So really, when it comes down to what is a special need, it's a lot broader than people think it is. Now, the standards you put in the trust, and we don't run into this a lot now, but in the original special needs trusts, and in fact, almost any trust that was probably done before the year 2000, they had what was called purely supplemental language in it. It basically said, under no circumstances can you make any distributions for the benefit of a beneficiary that might cause a reduction or loss in public benefits. Well, one example would be that if you have language like that, you wouldn't be able to go ahead and hire a non-Denti-Cal dentist. The other thing is that for people on SSI, under the current rules, if you pay for food or shelter directly, the benefits are reduced by $325 a month. Now, in a lot of cases, that's not the end of the world, especially when it comes to shelter. I would say shelter is the biggest issue we deal with here. But on the other hand, if you have a purely supplemental trust, you wouldn't be able to use it for food or shelter. So if you have an older trust, you probably want to have that reviewed to make sure that it has discretionary language. In a discretionary trust, the trust is directed to consider any known income or resources available and make a common sense decision here about whether to pay for something or not. And they're not limited by the fact that it might cause a slight reduction, or in some cases, a total elimination of public benefits. If you think about it, we want to maximize the public benefits, but not to the point that we miss our objective. And our objective is, once again, to try to provide the best quality of life we can for our beneficiary with the resources we have at hand. Now, this is really important for many of you that peruse the internet all the time, because oftentimes you read that special needs trusts have a payback and all of this other stuff. Oftentimes, here's what they're talking about. There are two types of special needs trusts, okay? The first kind of special needs trust we're going to go through, which is not we're going to focus on tonight, but I want to show you the difference, especially since Alyssa promised we were going to tell you everything you need to know. So a first party trust is usually trust that funds that either come from like a personal injury lawsuit. Those are a lot of the cases we get. It could come from money from an inheritance that was unplanned or whatever, but it basically holds funds that belong to the person with the disability. Here, these are oftentimes called self-settled trusts, or I like to call them Medi-Cal or Medicaid payback trusts. What's common with those trusts is that you can set them up if the person has already inherited the money. You can set up the trust, but upon the death of the beneficiary, there is a lien for any Medi-Cal or Medicaid the beneficiary has used during their entire lifetime. That is only first party, or consider them in most cases litigation trusts. The trust that we're going to talk about tonight is the estate planning, or it's called by Social Security a third party special needs trust. It's a trust that holds property that's transferred from someone other than the beneficiary, oftentimes referred to as an estate planning trust. So an example, I have a niece here in New York with Down syndrome here, and I have set up a special needs trust for her, and all of her aunts and uncles are putting something in that trust. The money will never belong to Erica. Therefore, it's a third party trust here. And the other part of this is that upon Erica's death, if there's anything left, it does not go back to pay for Medicaid for any Medicaid she's used during her lifetime. And that's one of the big differences. Now, with the first party trust, once again, it allows property of a disabled individual to be placed in trust and not considered an available resources for SSI and Medicaid eligibility if certain things are met. First off, it has to be assets of an individual who is under the age of 65 and disabled. Okay. It can be established by the beneficiary themselves or the beneficiary's parent, grandparent, legal guardian, or the court. But it also has to provide that the state will receive all amounts remaining on the termination or upon death equal to the total amount of medical assistance paid on behalf of the individual under any state's Medicaid program. So that's the first party trust. And in many ways, if you can, that's the trust you want to avoid, unless it's a large personal injury suit or whatever. The trust must also be irrevocable. It must be for the sole benefit, and it has to be in complete control of somebody other than the beneficiary. Once again, the beneficiary cannot be the trustee and cannot be in control of those funds. The third party trust is actually much simpler. By the way, you'll notice up on top, it says third party special needs trust. And it also has this word POMS, SIO 1120.200A17. What the heck is that? Does it have you ever noticed when you call Social Security, it sounds like they're reading a script, and they are reading a script. And part of this is if you were to take the SIO 1120.200 and Google that, one of the things would pop up is what's called a POMS, a Program Operation Manual System writing, which are instructions to eligibility workers on how to manage a specific situation. So the instructions they're giving here is a third-party trust is a trust established with properly belonging to someone other than the beneficiary, a third party. Could be a parent, could be a sibling, could be an uncle, could be a neighbor. It just can't be the beneficiary. And Social Security is always looking out for situations where a trust is allegedly funded by a third party, but in reality, it's created with a beneficiary's money. The example would be, let's say your child gets a $50,000 inheritance, and rather than go through all the hassle of doing one of these first party trusts, you go ahead and create a third-party trust and estate planning trust and put it in there. Well, here's the problem. If probably more like when Social Security finds out, they are going to invalidate that trust because you funded it with the beneficiary's funds. Okay, moving ahead. It can be established by anyone other than the beneficiary or the spouse. It can be revocable to the grantor. In most cases, when an attorney does a special needs trust, they start off as it being revocable until it is actually funded. The majority of special needs trusts that not only we do, but the majority of my colleagues do are not funded until the person passes away, unless there's some other reason to do it, and there is no payback requirement. Distributions can benefit others. This is one of the differences between the two trusts here. So for instance, in a first party trust, you can't use it for Christmas gifts for anybody other than the beneficiary. In a third party trust, it's not uncommon that we'll have the beneficiary go out and buy Christmas presents or whatever holiday you celebrate in the name of the beneficiary, and that you can do. So anyway, it can be a testamentary trust, meaning that it can be part of your living trust. We seldom do wills in California. Or it can be what's called a standalone trust, is what we do in 95% of the cases with a pour-over provision in the grantor's will or living trust. By a standalone trust, what I mean is we do a separate document. It is still usually revocable. And in the living trust, here, we actually put provisions in it that say when I pass away, whatever is going to go to Kathy goes into a third-party trust. The advantages of a standalone trust is it allows other family members or loved ones to contribute to the trust. Go back to my niece, Erica. If it were just part of my living trust, nobody's going to contribute to that. But since we have a separate document, it's very easy for folks to do it. It allows you to customize the administration provisions, which need to accommodate management issues that are very different than a typical living trust. Most living trusts basically are designed to get the children to adulthood, and then once everybody is an adult, to divide up the assets and pass them out. That's not always true, but oftentimes it is. A special needs trust is an entirely different animal, and these things go on and on and on. The other part of it, it allows greater privacy here. By that, basically, what we're saying is that if you put the special needs trust in your living trust, everybody who's named as a beneficiary of that living trust, whether they have anything to do with the special needs trust or not, has a right to the entire living trust. By setting it up as a separate document, you can have more privacy, and oftentimes these are pretty personal documents. Now, here's kind of a nice graph here that kind of goes through the difference between the two trusts. So a first-party trust can be set up by the beneficiary or a parent, grandparent, legal guardian, or the court. A third party or an estate planning trust can be set up by anybody except the beneficiary or spouse. In a first party trust, you have to be under the age of 65. In a third party trust, there are no restrictions. You can set this up for a child. You can set this up for a grandparent. The remainder, once again, there's a payback for the first party trust, but in a third party trust, you're free to leave it to whomever you like. Distributions are very limited in a first party trust because they can only go for the beneficiary's needs, whereas in a third party trust, you can actually allow distribution to be made to others. A first party trust must always be irrevocable. A third party trust is normally revocable until the grantor, the person who creates the trust, passes away or determines for other reasons that it should be irrevocable. And then as far as taxes are concerned, once again, I'm not going to get into taxes tonight, here, but the first party trust is taxed as if it's owned by the beneficiary without interfering with their benefits. A third party trust is a little bit more complex. In fact, it's called a complex trust, but it has lots and lots and lots of tax advantages. Okay, so now if that weren't enough, there's another player out there, which is a pooled trust. Now we go back to this. I am the trustee of the Golden State Pooled Trust, and there's about 7 or 8 pooled trusts that operate in California. And once again, I'm here to represent advocacy. So there are many fine pooled trusts out there, and there's something you might want to consider. They're somewhat like a cross between a 401k and a traditional special needs trust. In most cases, the traditional way to use it is that, for instance, Golden State Pooled Trust as an example, there is a master agreement. There's one trust that actually allows multiple beneficiaries. And what happens is if you decide to set up a trust account with the Golden Estate Pooled Trust through the master agreement, you sign a contract, which is called a joinder agreement. Okay, so beneficiaries don't get their own documents. They basically are subject to a contract called the joinder agreement that you sign with the beneficiary, with the pooled trust itself. Then the trust is administered like any other special needs trust. Okay. Some trusts serve specific populations. So Proxy Parent is a trust that serves primarily persons with behavioral health or mental health issues. The California Pooled Trust, which is run by the Inland Regional Center, here serves mostly persons with developmental disabilities. Some provide service to a wide geographic area. So, for instance, Golden State Pooled Trust serves the entire state of California. Some are more local. So, for instance, the JLA Trust in Los Angeles serves primarily Los Angeles. Some have first party trusts, some have third party trusts. Generally, they're not able to accept all types of assets, because what happens is oftentimes they pool the funds, so they can't really hold real estate directly or business interests or that sort of things. But even so, they do have customized investment options. When you're looking at different options here, and there's advantages and disadvantages of each, a pooled trust is something you might want to look at. They're a good option for smaller trusts, but they can also be used for larger trusts. They can be used for people over the age of 65. And annual fees are often less than a private trustee or a corporate trustee. So there's pros and cons to that. As far as the first versus third, here, first party trust can be used for people over 65. I think because of time, I'm going to skip this slide, but I'm going to go to this next slide. So now let's go back to this. The traditional way that you use a pooled trust is that you sign a joinder agreement, basically a contract. Let's say you're doing this once again for Kathy here. And so you would be setting this up for the benefit of Kathy and signing a contract, and then you would fund it with cash or life insurance or something along that along that line. Okay. Now, the other thing that many pooled trusts do is they will actually administer a standalone trust, a traditional special needs trust. Okay. And so when you're doing that with a third party trust, there are situations where they may make a lot of sense. A third party trust a pool trust operates no differently than any other trust. Funds are not subject to a payback. You can make gifts, and there's no age limitation. Let me just go back to this real quick with the standalone trust. In many situations, and I'm not sure we put this slide in here, you know, for my clients, I like to keep all the different options open. So oftentimes we might be looking at a pool trust to manage a normal standalone trust. But oftentimes what we'll do is we'll say that upon death, we would like let's say it's the JLA trust to manage this trust. And we might say that we nominate JLA trust, comma, or a private professional fiduciary, corporate trustee, or a pooled trust of either a trust protector or advisory committee members choosing. What is that? We're going to get to that in just a minute. So once again, part of this is choosing the right management team. Okay. I can't emphasize that enough, because you can have the best written trust in the world, but it's the trustee in the end that's going to be the issue. The problem that we run into in many cases, okay, and I know this just as being an attorney that has a lot of cases that are actually under administration, this is a lot for a family member to manage. There's a lot of technical rules. It's not that it can't be done, but there's a lot of technical rules involved in this here. And there's so many ways to screw this up. And so I usually recommend to my clients, if it's at all possible, let's try to use a professional trustee. Now, I threw this slide in here, and I think in the chat here, I'm going to put a link in to this website. We're going to talk about different kinds of trustees, different options. And one of the things I'm going to talk about are professional fiduciaries. And we even have a number of professional fiduciaries that are watching this today. In fact, if you are a professional fiduciary, why don't you do a shout out in the chat and let them know that you're here and where you serve. But to find a professional fiduciary, the link is right up there, and I just put it in the chat. Okay, so let's go forward. The traditional model, and in fact, if I have any of my old clients here from 30 years ago, I want to apologize before we get started. Part of this is neither I nor most of the practitioners who were doing this really appreciated how important the trustee is. And so I think in most cases, when we would come to the part about who's going to be the trustee, if somebody says, well, we're going to name their sister as the trustee, I'd go, sure, okay. And then who do we name after that? Well, here's the problem with that. First off, I'm not saying that a sibling or a family member should never be the trustee, but it's a lot of responsibility for a family member. And I have to tell you, I get a lot of situations where siblings just want to be siblings. They don't want to necessarily be their disabled sibling's keeper, Now, some people feel exactly the opposite. But the problem with it is if you name somebody as the trustee of this trust and you don't give them the proper supports, they're doomed to fail. Okay. So how can we avoid this? Now, I have a couple of models that I use, and I'm going to run through a couple of these because let's go back to this. Whereas I think you should think long and hard before making a sibling the trustee. There is a role for siblings, okay? One is, and this is a very common model, oftentimes in the trust, what we put in is that we're going to name a trustee, but we're going to have an advisory committee who's going to oversee the trustee. So the trustee manages the funds, makes the distributions, does the taxes, keeps the records, and does all those things. The trustee is, let's say, supported by an advisory committee that recommends the distributions. can amend the trust if necessary, because I can guarantee you the laws are going to change in ways we cannot anticipate. And we got to be able to amend that trust in order for it to be able to achieve its goal. And if necessary, replace the trustee. Okay. Also, care management is an essential part of administration of trust, and it can include a care manager. This kind of creates a checks and balance system. And a lot of the trusts we set up, the advisory committee actually works with the trustee once a year to do what's called a distribution plan, to just kind of figure out what are our objectives for the trust this year, and what are we going to spend money on and how much. And also look at this, that if we spend at this rate, when are we, when are we going to run out of money? It's a business plan. And that way this thing can move on with, family giving some oversight, but not being involved on the day-to-day basis. I'm going to skip the rest of, these, I'll go to model 4. You're free to go through this here later. But the other thing to consider is having the trust managed by a pooled trust, even though it is an individual trust. Some pooled trusts have care managers. JLA has its own care managers or whatever. With us at the Golden State Pooled Trust, we don't have our own care managers, so we hire them. And once again, many pooled trusts that will do this will be accountable to an advisory committee. So let's talk about advisory committees. When you're working with an advisory committee and setting this up, okay, the way we like to do it is not just say there's an advisory committee and they're going to produce a plan, but be really specific about how it's going to run. What we like to put in is that there would be a chairperson where their primary duty is going to be to pull the advisory committee together, not less than annually. Oftentimes it is just annually. There should be a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4. I mean, it's not like it's set in stone, but you don't want this thing to be huge here. And once again, the grantors, the clients can set up kind of a schedule of who they would like to have on the advisory committee, but the advisory committee is going to have a process where they can keep adding folks as folks drop off, and inevitably they will drop off. Once again, to keep it relevant here, usually what we focus on is that the primary focus of the advisory committee is to work with the trustee, the fiduciary here, to come up with an annual plan and provide that level of oversight, not day-to-day oversight. Okay, we give them the power to change trustees, which can be very important here. First off, for a trust that's going to last 70 years, if you hire a fiduciary who's 40, you would have to have a fiduciary who's going to live until they're 110 years old. Is that right? Here. And that's just not going to work. So there's also part of the whole relationship between the trustee and the beneficiary. It's a very personal relationship. And when it works, it's a magic thing. And when it's not working, most fiduciaries, most trustees would like to be replaced themselves. And I've had cases where we've just had to swap out trustees a couple of times until we just find the right person. And by the way, this has to work for the beneficiary. It also has to work for the fiduciary. Couple of things real quick, and I know I did run through that pretty quickly, but I did want to leave time for questions. Couple of things to cover. Okay. And, part of PHP is getting education, but the other part to me of the family resource centers, or specifically the PHP, is, the need for constant advocacy. I want to tell you that special needs trusts are great tools here, but in order to really make this work properly, these things don't work in a vacuum. So one of the things I'm really hoping for you advocates out there is to learn more about the actual administration of the trust. And when you're doing programs and things like that, do more than just having the attorney show up and say, well, let's show you how to protect public benefits and that kind of thing. In the end, it's the trustee. And so for many of you, wherever you are, and if you're with an organization, I would get to know my local Professional Fiduciary Association of California here chapter and engage with them. The other thing is we need to demand more from our professionals. So one of the things I'm going to ask Amy to put in is a link to a program we've been working on called the KTLP program, the Keep the Lanterman Promise program, which is a training for professionals and families on the basics of the Lanterman Act. You know, one of my favorite sayings is if your fiduciary or your attorney doesn't know the difference between an IPP and an SUV, how are they possibly going to know how to supplement the services if they don't understand the service and the process? So part of the whole concept of the KTLP program is that we will be listing eventually with the ARC of California attorneys and fiduciaries and care managers who have taken the course. Now, that won't tell you how competent they are, but at least they took the course. We need more engagement. We need more interaction. Lastly, and then let's let the questions fly. If you have a sibling, if you have a child or somebody who has been affected by disability and wants to do something or is looking for a profession, I cannot think of a better profession to get into to help persons with disabilities than either becoming a professional care manager or a professional fiduciary, especially if you have lived with a family member and have dealt with the challenges of trying to provide a quality of life and also go through the maze of dealing with public services. If this is something you would like to help others with, this is a great thing to get involved with. With that, Amy, do we have any questions or shall we just go home?
Of course we have questions.
And may I just say before we start the questions that in the chat I dropped in, and I can do it again, the English evaluation link and the Spanish evaluation link. If people could please just click on that in between questions, and there are only 3 questions to it. It'll go very quickly, but it really helps to keep us bringing this quality program to viewers like you.